Welcome to Mini Fights. I'm Brian, and this is the second episode of Vaporwave Black Order. We're going to jump right into our non-metallic metal here, and in the last episode I had finished hand rendering it on Corvus Glaive. Now I'm using an airbrush to work in the blends on the rest of the models. Figuring out where to apply this scrofulous brown on top of the olive drab is a little tricky, to be honest with you. It's more art than science, but generally speaking, I aim for the higher areas and the sort of center line of cylindrical areas, which his armor has a lot of curvature to it. Obviously, his boots are basically round, his gauntlets are round, that sort of thing. So that was my guide there on Thanos, and generally that's how I went on everybody else. The weapons are a little trickier. I mixed in a little ice yellow to build up the next layer, so this is the exact same progression we went through by hand on Corvus Glaive, but we're going to build up as much of it with an airbrush as we can on these models. Same thing, kind of aiming for the center of areas I've already lit, applying a little to edges just to make sure that they show a reflection and that they exist. Step on Thanos, I'm going to kind of put him next to Glaive and you can see the progression. We're not there yet, obviously, we've got some more layers to do, but we've got some of that built up. Now we're going to go in and we are going to line the gold back with our olive drab. Now this step was not necessary on Glaive because we built it up by hand, so we just left the olive drab in the recesses. The airbrush doesn't really do that. You could shoot at angles and kind of miss recesses to some extent, but a lot of times you just got to go back by hand and build it back up. Thanos has a bunch of articulated sort of like lines and runes and stuff in his armor, so he really needs a lot of lining. The other models less so. You can see here, Ebony Maw is a fairly quick one, just a few, just kind of differentiating those little plates that are down his tabard. And just a couple other spots, but this was a fairly quick process comparatively to lining the purple, for example, earlier in the first video. And we're deep in our hand rendering here. We're working into that third layer of highlighting, which is the ice yellow mixed with scrofulous. This is just building up more light in the spots where it makes sense. This axe is very tricky, and I would say that I'm not 100% happy with the way it came out. I think it looks gold, but I think there's a little too much uniform light on it. I wish there was a little more dark overall. Building in some sort of streaking as well, using the texture created by the brush to kind of create like a reflected look. So you can see I get kind of sketchy with the application of paint sort of in the middle areas as we go here. That's kind of one of the steps of non-metallic metal, is building in that reflective, streaky look. Overall, I would say that Thanos is the model I spent the most time rendering all this light on in the non-metallic metal. He just has a very complex piece of armor. The boots are complicated, the waist piece, the gauntlets. There's just a ton of stuff going on. So I tried to not get fatigued and like rush it. Sometimes it's easy to get to a step like this and you just get bored with it. You've done it on 4 models already. You're tackling the most complicated one. You start to get a little loose with your application. I really tried to focus on not doing that and keep myself working at the same pace that I worked on everything else. That is something that I tend to do. I like to get things done, and I get a little frustrated with rote procedure. But I really locked my focus down on this model and made sure I gave him the best treatment on his non-metallic metal out of all of them. Obviously, he's the leader model. He's the guy. We're going to end our non-metallic metal with the points of white, just like we did on Corvus Glaive. And you can see as it's coming together, it looks just like Glaive pretty much. There's maybe a slight difference to the hand-rendered look when you look really closely at the transitions between the blends. Sometimes hand-rendered non-metallic gold can actually look more realistic because of that sketchy application of the paint. But I think the airbrushing was a really good time saver on a pretty complex set of models I've been working on here. So ultimately I'm happy with it, especially on Thanos where I really built it up as best I could. Just base coating some black here. Obviously this isn't going to just be black. Can't have that in a vaporwave scheme, right? It's got to be black highlighted with turquoise up into like a white. It'll have some cool color in it. That's the plan here as we move forward. I take a break from base coating the black here to render out Proxima Midnight's flesh tone and hair, which in the canon is bright blue. And why not? Let's keep it that way. I really like it, and I think it fits the color scheme otherwise. I left basically, as a shade, I left some of the original purple base coat, that warm purple we mixed up between sort of the masses of the hair. Base coated it with that really bright blue from Vallejo, built up a little white into it as highlights. That's that. Pretty quick stuff. Pops real nice. And on another break from the black, I'm going to hand render up all Corvus Glaive's cloak. Now his cloak is clearly like really ratty, and it's like something that's, you know, aged and weathered. So we went for a leather look, and I've been flipping through my Angel Heraldez painting books, and he does a lot of really good textural things on leather. So not only does he build it up normally with the correct colors and the right amount of value and color contrast and all the things he's really good at, he also applies a texture by kind of hatching and building some hatching in. So as I build up my layers of highlighting here, and you can see the colors I used in the text, always look at that text if you are curious about what colors I used. I put it all in there. I'm starting to hatch as I apply my final edge highlight here. And I actually go back to and apply some hatching of like a darker brown, and then sort of highlight the edges of those hatches with my highlight color, which basically visually creates a scratch. So there's a dark line and a light line above it or below it, depending on where the edge would catch the light. So that's the plan here with him. I think I did a pretty decent job of retaining the sort of purplish tone in the recesses and the just purplish nature of the leather. So it doesn't just look like a leather coat thrown on this guy wearing a spacesuit. It still ties together with the scheme while being like his own sort of color, right? Like the rest of the models don't have this, he does. It also, one of the concerns when picking colors for this was making sure that I didn't overlap with the non-metallic metal. It's easy to like paint some leather and paint some non-metallic metal and go, oh, they're kind of the same. I tried to use different colors the best I could. Keeping the purple in there, I think, was a huge key to that. So we're back to the black that we base coated earlier, and now we're just going to render it up. And I'm using one of my favorite colors of all time, Privateer Press P3 Coal Black. It's a dark, translucent turquoise color. It just works great for if you want that sort of, if you want to highlight pure black up to something with a little bit of a greenish tone. I don't know. It's just the best. Just buy it. If you can find it, buy it. P3 paints are kind of hard to come by these days. You can order them direct from Privateer still, I think. Highly recommend it. I've got a couple pots here. I've stocked up because of how much I use it. The next layering, of course, is just mixing in a little bit of ice yellow, another color that I use very much on almost everything. Works really nice to push the coal black a little more towards greenish, a little more towards yellowish as we build it up. Creates a little more of a color shift, which is always good. We're going to try to keep the highlights on this relatively tight, so it implies, if not black, at least like a dark color still. The more of the black, original black we cover with these highlights that we're putting on, the more we're going towards, oh, this is like turquoise or blue or whatever. We're trying to still imply black by keeping the highlights tight. I did a reasonably good job of this. I think I could have done better in retrospect. Like I could really kind of micro highlighted it. But I don't think the rest of the model doesn't have that kind of visual logic with the highlighting. So it's kind of weird to throw like little tiny point highlights into just one area. So ultimately pretty happy with the way it came out. Here's our final highlight here, which is Vallejo game color Verdigris, which is a real whitish green. And then I think I may have gone with pure white at the end. I honestly can't remember, but you can see the process here. Just keeping them small, hitting the points, trying to have the light on the fabric, the space purple fabric, and this makes sense visually next to each other. And here we are just hitting our final highlight on it. It's really starting to come together. You can see the cylindrical nature of the shafts of the weapons and things by the way I highlighted them. The sort of layering of Nebula's weapons, the sort of, her sword looks sort of almost like an antenna, like it kind of gets smaller as it gets pulled out. Hitting those layers and making sure those visually are available, you know, the viewer can see them at a distance. That's one of the keys with highlights. You're not just building up light for light's sake, you're also trying to make edges and points show at a distance. But thanks so much for watching. We're going to move on to our third video here in a few days. That's going to complete the entire set of models. We're going to do the basing and all the other final stuff. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you then.